Hey, everybody, it's Gregg Bendian at the ProgCast, where you'll find me talking to the most interesting creative musicians on the planet. And today is definitely that case. I do want to say up front, thank you always to our patrons for supporting this kind of programming. It's not a lot of this type of thing on the internet where we really get into the nuts and bolts of things of music and creativity and concepts. So I do appreciate your support, and our patrons do get special perks like bonus material from the interviews. We've been doing a fun thing lately, which has been lightning round, where we do short one word or short answer questions. That's for the patrons. So consider joining us on Patreon, as we are going to be giving you a lot of bonus stuff. And so let's jump in. I have been fascinated with this musician for some time, and the kind of music that she's doing, it to me is really the perfect blend of how we put together what it is we are doing when we're making music. And she is a Grammy-winning pianist and composer. She has worked with some of the top people like Dave Holland, Terry Lynn Carrington, Craig Taborn, and Esperanza Spalding. So I'm very happy to welcome to the ProgCast Kris Davis. Hi, Kris. How are you?
Hi, Greg. I'm good. Thanks for having me.
This is a pleasure. A friend had turned me on to your stuff, and as soon as I heard it, I was like, "Oh, this is what you're supposed to be doing." I know, I don't know if that resonates with you, but there's a sort of very common ground that I share with you in terms of having some classical training and taking it into this other area, or creating a space where all these things can coexist. Like I remember being in college, studying composition, studying percussion, music in general, and saying, I have to decide, what am I going to be? Am I going to be in the back of the orchestra and go ding? Or, am I going to be a little bit more involved and actually get all of my ideas out there by being the main person that does it? Don't expect other people to play your pieces, and so that was kind of what I was getting the vibe from you, was that you, at a certain point, you decided that these worlds were going to coexist. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I like that word coexist. I'm not sure I've used it as a way to describe my music, but it's kind of a perfect word. So thank you. I'm gonna have to steal that.
Steal
Um,
that, and I stole from Steve Hackett of Genesis, collision.
Collision, that's good too. There's definitely some collision going on.
Right.
Yeah, I resonate with what you're saying about, you know, studying a certain kind of genre of music, getting really deep into it. And there were definitely times where you kind of get to a point of studying something and you're like, am I going to do this as like my thing, my profession? And there was always something that stopped me from going forward in those various genres, like in classical music. At some point I'd been playing it since I was 7, and around 16, 17, I just thought, I don't know if this kind of a life is the right fit for me. But of course I love the music. So anyway,
But
I
isn't
got
it more fun to hang out with jazz guys than classical people?
yeah, I mean, it's different. It's a different way of
It's
thinking,
different.
sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll say it's different. Okay.
It's different. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then there was some overlap. I was getting into jazz around that time, and I just felt, oh, this like improvisation was really a better fit for me as a player. Because I mean, one of the biggest things is like you make a mistake and you just play it 3 or 4 more times and it's an idea.
Don Cherry taught us that. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So that idea, kind of stuck with me, and Of course, listening to Thelonious Monk and Herbie Hancock and Keith Jarrett and Bud Powell. I got really into jazz and more kind of mainstream jazz, playing standards um, and then there was a kind of a point where it's like, did I want to be like a, burning bebop pianist, or did I want to be like a Keith Jarrett clone? Because I was obsessed with Keith Jarrett. Um, and then there were things revealing themselves like, well, maybe that's not the way forward either. And then I discovered improvised music at the Banff Center for the Arts in 2000. And I
Who
met,
was there at that time?
yeah, I met people like Tony Malaby and Ben Monder and Angelica Sanchez. Um, and that was really,
Was Dave there at that time? Dave Holland? I know you work with
no,
Dave.
he wasn't. But it's funny now, we're talking about the Banff Center, which he ran many decades before I went. And there's certain things that he put in place that I experienced as a student there. So it was
Awesome.
really kind of
Yeah.
cool, full circle moment. Um, yeah, so I got into improvised music and was exposed to it at the Banff Center for the Arts. And I moved to New York the next year and kind of sought out the people that I had met at the workshop who were doing more improvised music and composing for improvised music and blending the two. And that's kind of where I found my spot for
Mhm.
the next 15 or 20 years. Was working in it was called the downtown scene, as you probably
Oh,
know.
yeah.
But I moved to New York like 2 weeks before September 11th. So then everything totally changed.
I
We got
played with
city.
Interzone with Nels and Alex at the Knitting Factory,
Yeah.
that week, the week after, and we smelled the smell. What part of town were you in?
I was living in New Jersey at the time. Um,
Where?
I was well, actually on the day that it happened, I was at Renee Rosnes's house and Billy Drummond's house. I was staying with them.
And yeah, okay. So,
Yeah, they're in
yeah,
West Orange.
the oranges, yeah.
Yeah.
So very cool. And I love Billy so much, and Dylan was one of my students. His son, very musical kid.
Really?
Oh
Oh
yeah,
my goodness. Yeah, I used
yeah.
to babysit him. That's how I met Renee, really, was babysitting him when they came to Toronto.
Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, Dylan's got a band and he's writing and he's his own musician. Uh, he's not necessarily a jazz musician, but he's doing his thing. So
Oh, that's
Rini, yeah, and
that's
I would
great to
love to
hear.
have Rini on. I mean, Bill has done an interview with me for Yale, Bill Charlap, and so he's another sort of piece of the piano puzzle. It's so interesting. Um, oh yeah, so talk about that. Yeah.
Um, Wait, which part about Renee or
Well,
or
no,
about New
just
York and
coming to New York.
yeah, so like you said, actually I'm surprised to hear you got into the knitting factory a week later because everything was closed down
We
for
went through, and this was the tour that was like, do we tour after this happened? When is there going to be another? Is this an ongoing thing now? Like a lot of people don't maybe remember these things, but it was imprinted because the two things had collided where I had a new album out. We were going to go on the road and we were going to go with all the gear in one truck, one van, and we had to go through police cordons and they had to look in our vehicle. And it was it was a thing. Yeah. And then when we got there, it turns out that we started to realize this was the right thing to do was to go on with the tour. And Nels, I think was kind of like was really nervous about it, but then he got into it.
okay.
I just remember that like people were nervous about it. You're going to drive across the country with, all your gear and everything now, and people are suspicious or paranoid. Okay, so when you came to New York, what was happening for you?
Well, nothing because I couldn't legally work. I was like just coming down from Canada. So I was trying to figure out how I was going to work. I also didn't know a lot of musicians because I didn't go to school, on the East Coast or in the States.
Did you
So
come with an intention of creating something, making something happen? What was your dream when you decided to
I
leave Toronto area?
yeah, I just always wanted to move to New York. When I was
Yeah.
17, I was living in Calgary, and my mom, I was like, I want to go to New York, and my mom was like, why don't you just like, don't just let's do a stepping stone. Why don't you go to Toronto?
Oh,
And
you were in Calgary first. Yeah.
yeah, that's where I grew up. So yeah, I just always wanted to be there. I just like everybody's there, all the people I love live there or lived there, and it just seemed like such a great energy. So I want to be part of that. And so I came down. I didn't know a lot of people other than meeting a few folks at the Banff Center. And it was really hard. Like I would call people, some of the other students I met, and say like, "Hey, can we play a session?" And everybody was super busy just trying to like make it work in New
Sure.
York. So it was a real challenge for the first year, especially, I would say, just trying to meet people and um so I just, and I tell my students this now, like I just had to make a plan. So I put it together like a journal, and I had a practice journal, and I had like a life goals journal, and
Mm-hmm.
just like a mental health journal, and just
Mm-hmm.
like really trying to like, zone my time into the things that were important to me and what I wanted to do. And eventually, took some lessons, started to make some connections and play sessions and things, and it happened slowly, but I got there.
It it does happen slowly, often
Yeah.
the case. I'm very curious. Listening to your music, I clearly can hear classical procedures, if you will, or certain contemporary classical issues being dealt with in, I don't even want to say a jazz setting, but let's say, a piano, bass, and percussion setting. And I'm really curious about how these two worlds coexist for you, the composing, how you deal with pitch. I heard an amazing duet with you and Julian Lage where you were just playing two notes at a time on the instrument, and this idea of orchestrating on the piano. I think I would love to hear you talk about that because I noticed that you're not playing like a jazz pianist if you are playing so-called jazz, and you're not even improvising like a jazz person. And that's a compliment, by the way.
I know. I take it as a compliment.
Awesome. So please just tell me about that. That's interesting.
Um, when I got into improvised music, I was trying to play like a jazz pianist. So I was really dealing with comping, chords that sound good in a certain area of the piano, just the role of what the pianist does.
Mm.
Um, I was trying to bring that to this improvised setting, and it didn't really work because, when you're improvising and making something on a spot with all different musicians, it's really a collaborative thing. It's a collective thing. And the rules of like head, solo head are gone. There's no rules at all. So there's a lot of freedom in that. But if you're bringing those rules from something else and implying them into the situation, it's somewhat limiting for the musician. So, for example, like dealing with dealing with harmony, where as a pianist, when I was playing, I was always controlling the harmony and everybody had to play around me. And suddenly, like, so I was the boss, I was the one leading, and that's not really what the music was about. It's about collaboration and the horn players developing the harmony and me responding. So
Or
this
equal
experience,
footing.
yeah, exactly. So this experience led me to start searching around to figure out, well, how else can I relate to the piano and for this particular
Yeah.
experience? Um, And so that leads to classical music and more contemporary classical influences like Georgi Ligeti, who's
Yeah.
one of my favorites. I mean, every time you hear a piece of his, within the first like 5 seconds, you know what the piece is about.
Well,
It's
that's so great that you mentioned that, and I want to talk about this because I also heard something that I don't hear enough people doing, which is staying with ideas and motivic development. But yeah, Ligeti and how did you feel about Stockhausen's piano music or the Boulez pieces or any, did you deal with any of those?
Um, I mean, I love Stockhausen's music, but that came later, and it kind of came from those lecture series on YouTube. Have you seen those?
Yeah, of course. You got to see those, man. It's required viewing.
They're like pieces of art, they're
Totally. It was like
incredible.
talking to Wayne. I don't know if you ever spoke with Wayne, but like, okay, I'm going with this.
Yep.
Wait, what just happened? What did we just do?
I know, and all of them are incredible. Like the one about using 12 tone rows, and he's talking about the mantra piece, and he's talking about like being just the way it starts, and he's talking about being in the car and in the States, and he's driving, and it's these little melodies are starting to come, through the 12 tone rows. So he writes that on the board, and then he starts to like expand upon it and like drawing these scales that like expand, each time. And it's just, and he explains they're the stars around it. I mean, it's just the whole
Yes.
thing is amazing.
It is amazing. He's coming up a lot lately. I don't know what it is. People coming to me talk about Stockhausen. I'm always talking to people about Stockhausen. Well, at William Paterson University, where I teach, there was a Stockhausen piece last semester, which was just his choreography, the score for his choreography, and the key to the movements and the hand shapes, and we could go with that for a while. But what a font of inspiration, right? For a guy who's just creativity, in living form.
Totally. And it's interesting that like closer to the end of his life, he got into the idea of what he called intuitive music, which is really improvisation, but
Right. Well, he had Hugh Davies from Music Improvisation Company was one of his guys. I mean, there's a crossover that we don't even have to prove. It's you know what I mean? The guys
totally.
that came out of Stockhausen, a lot of Brits were working with Stockhausen as assistants, learning live electronics, doing whatever the crazy things they were doing over there. I work with Derek Bailey, so it was very important to me to see these connections and to feel like it was okay to bring classical into Derek's music, or it was okay to bring classical sounds into Cecil's music,
Right.
bowed cymbals or prepared drum set.
Right.
So I really love where you're going with this. So please tell me more.
Let's see. We were talking
When
about
you're
like,
composing,
yeah.
what is important material to you to have played specifically, and what is important material for you that's fodder for improvisation? And I know you're going to say they're connected.
Yeah, totally connected. And also it's a different kind of process than writing classical music where you come up with the idea, you write the piece, you try to not fill in all the spaces because you're leaving room for improvisation. And then there's that third step of like bringing the sketch or the thing in and then giving it to the people, the artists who have these, individual voices that you want to come out and giving it over to them to say like, what do you want to bring to this? Which is very unique to jazz, I feel, and improvised music. And it's one of my favorite parts of the process. So I'm often you know, writing things, melodies, forms, but leaving holes and spaces for these moments for people to interpret how they want to interpret it.
What do you give them in those spaces to work with?
I mean, it's a wide range.
Please tell us.
I don't know. Every piece is different. Sometimes it's just like, sometimes it's just a little like a melody. Sometimes it's a form. So a lot of times, like I stopped writing chord changes and chord symbols because that always leads to a certain way of interpreting harmony that eventually started to really bother me.
So what
Um,
you did pitch structures then?
I just wrote chords out,
Yeah. Right.
or like
Here are the
wrote
notes
out.
in this chord.
Yeah, or just like provided the score and say like, okay, you improvise over this. Like I have a piece on my record, Diatom Ribbons, where Julian Lage is soloing over this tune called Brain Feel. And it's kind of hard. It's an 11, it's slow. And the harmony's shifting in weird ways. And I was just like, I'm not writing the chords. You have to figure it out, just because I don't want someone to see C major 7 and like do the thing that they do on C major 7.
Oh, that's so interesting.
I
Yeah.
want them to search. I want them to dig. Like, I'm not afraid of wrong notes. That's not interesting to me. Like, bring on the wrong notes. It's really about intention and rhythm and melody, and a spatial awareness that's more important to me.
We talked about Don Cherry and then turning the mistake into a motif, but
Yeah.
also this Dolphy quote came to mind, which is, there are no wrong notes. It's where they're going to and where they're coming from. And well, obviously, and where they arrive. I mean, so it's very interesting idea of where you're saying a certain amount of control is not needed, right? I mean, a certain amount of
Yeah.
like definition is not required. But again, you're working with really creative people with big ears.
Yeah, exactly. And they have a context of musical traditions that they bring to that situation where the situation might be challenging, but they're drawing from all these things. So
Hmm.
it's very different when I'm working with students who don't necessarily have that. And then, I'm providing like much more written material and structure in those situations.
Do you have a favored way, or are you always trying to have? I mean, you released an album of a week of performances at the Village Vanguard. Are you looking to present? This is so interesting to me about how we think of a set when you've done classical programming sets and then you're doing jazz programming sets, and now you're doing, how are you programming and presenting your music? I'm interested in this concept of the motifs that you work with and also the variety concept. Are you trying to do something different with every piece?
Yeah, that's really important to me. It has been since I started doing this 25 years ago. Um, yeah, thinking of, like you're saying, of thinking of the performance or a set or a record as like a whole suite in a way.
It's a
Because
book.
yeah, it's a book and it needs to be varied, it needs to have different elements, different aspects that draw the listener in. And if you heard the same song over and over in a set, sometimes we hear that.
Like Keith can open a concert with two ballads, but not me. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I
That's a good
mean?
challenge.
Look at the challenge. He's like, yeah, we're going to do
Yeah.
two ballads first.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a funny that always struck me as one of the funniest programming things I've ever seen someone have the guts to do.
Yeah, you probably get to a point where you've been doing it so long, so many times, you're like, I need new challenges. How about two ballads? Let's start it off.
He blows my mind. Yeah.
But there's this element of, Monk's music of limitations, and that was one thing I was going to mention about Ligeti,
Yes.
and Monk. For me, those two are like so connected, in the way
Mm.
that they think about using limitations as a way to develop improvisation or the rest of the piece, whatever it is.
Does he ever go beyond motivic improvisation in his solos?
I mean, yeah, I would say so. It's very like rooted close to the
It's
melody.
so, I think even just isorhythmically, he's in that phraseology he's bringing over. He's very, very, very thematic improviser, right? He's not a bop player, is he?
Monk? No, no. I
No,
mean, he was from that era, but he's
but he's not.
his
Yeah.
own thing. But there's something about using limitations to generate language and ideas that create like a DNA in what you're doing. And that's always what I'm interested in. It's like, even if I'm varying things, there's still that little thing that's embedded in whatever I'm focused on.
Well, that's the material, isn't it? It's
It can be. I mean, it could be a lot of things, but for me, that's where like I just love that idea. That's the music that I'm drawn to in different kinds of genres of music. I'm always finding those pieces that stem from limitations are exciting to me.
well, the limitations free you, don't they? They
Oh,
focus you and free you.
yes. And they free you and they invite you to focus on other things. So whether it's like maybe you're stressed out about like playing some bebop lines over changes, but if you look at Monk's music, it's so like rhythmic. So now it's an invitation to like a tune like Evidence, really develop like the rhythmic aspect of that and not worry so much about all the chord changes that are under it. For
Well,
me,
there's a rhythmic
that's really
joke in those types of monk pieces. There's the rhythmic joke always. Like, think of Juan. Ba-ba-da-bum. He'll just be silly, and that's just such an amazing quality. Yeah, I
that
have.
I don't look at it as silly. I think like maybe things like that seem corny, but like that's the challenge and the invitation is to like make something impactful and meaningful out of something corny. So that's like no, there's no such thing as corny or silly or whatever. It's just
Well, I guess I'm saying I'm feeling the humor part of his music.
yeah,
Not, I'm saying I'm silly, not in throwaway, but fun, having intellectually this idea of,
right, like
you know,
playful. Yeah.
ba da 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 da
Yeah.
da 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 da, like, come on.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing, right? Like, who,
Totally.
when everyone's going a million miles an hour, he's like, no, here, check this out, 20 miles an hour.
It's playful.
It really is. And when he had the right guys, but those there are these just amazing pieces like Coming on the Hudson. It's just like, what is that?
Yeah.
Bum, bum, ba-dum, bum, da, zee, ba-dum, dee, da. Yeah. I mean, what is that? I had that conversation with Monk's son where I said, nobody plays these tunes. He's like, what tunes? I'm like, Locomotive. And then we're singing Locomotive together and talk about the Cardenas book. And it was just so great. And then at the same time, we simultaneously said, Light Blue. Right. So,
Totally. That Cardenas book is really great. That's like that is the book now. If you
I
have
think
any
it's the
questions
book.
about the right or wrong notes, it's pretty
You have
much
any questions, he'll make sure you understand what's happening.
it.
Just even the performance notes.
Yeah,
I love that book.
me too.
Okay, so other classical composers.
Morton Feldman was a big one.
Yes. Oh, yes. Slow,
Yep.
long, luxurious.
I love that piece, Patterns in a Chromatic Field. You know
Yeah.
that one? It's an
Do you
80
know?
minute piece.
Yeah, this 80-minute thing of piano and string quartet.
Oh yeah.
Saw it live. I wish they had told people in advance what was going to happen. I just had this conversation with my friend because it was at Princeton, Institute, and David Lang programmed the Stravinsky String Quartet, which is like 5 minutes of Feldman's World in 1924, followed by Feldman in the 80s with this piece. But they didn't. It was free, and they didn't tell people, and so as a result, they were like freaking out. Why is this? I'm trapped. And they just like start getting up to leave and stuff, and like we're in minute 40, minute 50, minute 60. And finally, I had this urge to just start saying to the people, no, stay for the ending. It's really cool. You don't want to miss the ending.
Yeah, you got to stay for the ending.
But what about his pitch? I mean, I hear Feldman in some of your work. And I know when you hear it because I know that I hear Messiaen in your work.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Absolutely. Totally. Yes. Um, well, Morton Feldman, he, as you know, like writes these very wide interval kind of
Yeah.
chord that when I heard that 20 years ago, it just kind of opened something because I was so used to playing these shell jazz voicings and suddenly like, oh, you play like two major sevenths, a whole step away. That
There's so many ways, right?
so many
Yeah.
colors. And the other thing is when you're playing with a bass player, they can put any note under that and it's gonna just make it another color. Whereas when you're really dealing with harmony, there are going to be some wrong notes on the bass part.
Right. The bass has got to be
So
right in Steely Dan tunes. Yeah.
yeah, and so I don't know, and I don't. Maybe that's why I play with so many bass players. They're freed to like anything they play, works in a way. And it's really about making instead of thinking about functionality in the way we think about harmony, thinking about it in color and texture and range and density.
So anybody could be forefront and anybody can be foundational. That's
Yep.
the other thing, right? Roles, Roles, in these pieces. I think about that very much. Every piece sort of different roles, different rules, maybe. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. But suddenly, like instead of having a role of the drummer or the bass player, those roles that we have in more mainstream jazz, they're gone because we're now each a composer and we're each a little orchestra.
Yeah.
So if you think about it in those terms, then we can access so many other things and colors of our instrument. And like you're saying, take on different roles. Like what if as the pianist, what if I'm just like a section of flutes here? How do I create that on the piano?
Mm-hmm.
And to go a step farther, when you were talking about Messiaen, Messiaen's like, there's these birds outside my window. Like, how do I make that sound on the piano that's not a microtonal instrument? And so he finds his way to create those sounds on the piano. So those sorts of things have always been really inspiring, drawing from outside sources.
I wanted so much to talk to you about outside sources because I just think this is where it is. It is, yes, you study music. There's pre-conventional for people who don't know, don't want to know, just enjoy playing music. There's conventional where people can play the music and they're appropriate with whatever genre is. And then there's post-conventional because we're in uncharted territory here. Like you have to make it work for people to want to listen to it. But so what's the new interesting way of looking at it? And I also think that when I hear you also doing this thing that I love, which is, I already did that. What are other ways of thinking of three people? And also the orchestration thing, so that you limit orchestration in a piece to, I'm not going to use the entire piano. And at the end of your improvisation with Julian Lage on KRIS Davis's YouTube channel, you can see this. You have the upper register piano exclusively, and I think some preparation on the top.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah, there's some clothespins up there that kind of give this glassy effect.
It's a wonderful sound, and not enough people explore that part of the piano. Do you ever notice that?
I do. I took a lesson with Jim McNeely a long time ago, and we're working on my pieces, and he's like, "This is great." He's like, "What about the rest of the piano?" And just that little nugget was enough to be like, "Yeah, what about the rest of the piano?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yep.
so if I'm teaching composition and or even songwriting, and they're all here in the middle, I say to them, well, you're a good piano player. There's this part of the piano down here, and there's this part up there. And actually, you can make the second verse more interesting than the first verse if you use more of the piano. So it's just, I love the piano so much, Kris, because it is an orchestra.
Yeah, there's so much in there.
So
And
much.
to what you were just saying, another thing about limitations,
Mm.
even something like, sit on your left hand, just use your right hand. Like, where does that lead you? There's all different ways you can
Herbie
create.
on orbits, right?
Mm-hmm.
Herbie, when he didn't know what to do with his left hand, he just, Miles, play with your right hand.
Oh, so that Dolores, that's like my favorite.
Dolores.
I recorded that because I love that tune and I love
But
the video.
Miles smiles, right? It's a particular moment in that group, I think. I think it could be my favorite. I mean, I love Nefertiti, but Miles, orbits,
Yeah, great.
when they're kind of confronting Ornette's world through Tony and Herbie's pushing. Did you know that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's so cool.
So great.
It's so great that I learned that from Miles. I learn from my students every time. Oh, what do you check? What do I need to check out? Right?
Right? Absolutely.
Yeah. First heard about hiatus coyote that way. First heard about,
Oh,
Crumb that way.
oh,
You know,
wow. Chrome was a big influence too.
really?
Yeah, those macrocosmos.
Oh yeah, Crumb. It Ancient Voices of Children. That one. That's heavy. That was the one that it was his breakthrough, I think, in he's the John Adams now. He's Steve Reich this year. Maybe he'll get it into Time Magazine or the New York Times.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely cyclical.
Interesting, right? So what is the difference in your approach with the larger group? So if we're talking about diatom rhythms and we're talking about the trio with Bob Hurst and Jonathan Blake.
Um, well, definitely two different projects. In Diatom Ribbons, it was more about
Did I say
well,
rhythms? I'm sorry, diatom ribbons.
yeah, no, it's okay. It was about bringing these two communities of musicians together. So I was, of course, like I was saying, in New York, involved in the more improvised music scene, and that's a really dynamic scene because there's artists coming from all different backgrounds, a lot of people improvising who never studied jazz, um, and finding each other and making music. And so I was part of that for a long time. I'm still considering myself part of that, even though I don't live in New York anymore. And then I started working with Terry Lynn Carrington in 2018. And
Shout out to Terry Lynn.
yes, Terry Lynn, the best.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I was meeting people in her community, like Esperanza Spalding and Val Genti, and I had a week at the Stone in New York, and I asked Val and Terry to play an improvised set with me, and that was the first time Terry had played an whole improvised set.
Oh,
It was awesome. It was really
of
great.
course. Yeah.
And then having Val Genti, who's a turntablist electronic musician who's drawing from, you can use spoken word, you can use percussion elements, can use pre-recorded elements in different ways. She just brought so many cool ideas and things to the project. So I thought this is like, I really want to dive into this and see like, how do I write for a turntablist? This was a new idea for
How
me.
do you write for turntable?
Well, Val, I mean, she kind of reads music, but she's more thinking as an improviser. So I'm cutting up stems for her. Sometimes I'm recording things and sending her stems and say, like, use this in this
Use
piece.
that. Oh, nice.
And then I'll sometimes say, use your own thing, here.
Mhm.
And then I ended up, Cecil Taylor passed away just before the record. And I really wanted to pay tribute to him. And I was like, how can I do this without, you know, copying or playing his music, and so I found this really cool clip of him being interviewed by Marion McPartland on Piano Jazz.
Twice. Twice she had him back. Did you know that? I know
I didn't
you
know
knew.
that.
Oh my God. So I don't know which one you have, but look for the two of them. Unbelievable that
Okay.
she can hang. Is this the one where she says, "Can we play such an what was the name of the tune? Love for Sale?" And he says, "Well, why don't we just play something that is the essence of G minor?"
I love it. I love it so
Right? And just that she's totally nonplussed. She's
yeah.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
you think that I can't hang with this? And he's just Cecil.
Yeah.
They're two, everybody go out and look for these if you want meeting of the minds. Cecil Taylor and Mary McPartland, two hangs. They play together. He plays, she plays.
Yeah.
Love it.
It's
I did a tape piece. This is so funny. I did a tape piece off of one of those, but please go ahead.
Oh, well, I found this moment that I was like, that's such a beautiful way. Like he's talking about the way that he thinks about music, and he's sort of stream of consciousness, also talking about a taxi ride and the joy of living. And, I was like, this is
Yeah.
great. This is a great way to pay tribute to him, is to take this stem and have Val, impose it over this piece of music, this section that I wrote the piece is called Diatom Ribbons. But that discovery led to like, oh, well, I could do this more. Like I can draw from the people that are inspiring to me and find little clips, because I'm never going to be a lyricist. That's not really my thing. But I really wanted to incorporate other people's words, and
Yeah, you
Val,
work with spoken word a lot.
yeah, and Val being there allows for that to be possible.
That's so cool. Terry Lynn also does interesting stuff with groups that include spoken word, and I find. Tell me then. Was it Malcolm? Was one of her vocalists? The actor. I can't remember his last name. He was on the Cosby Show.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yes,
you know
Malcolm
the guy.
Jamal Warner, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Malcolm Jamal Warner, right. So I find that interesting because I'm working on a record right now with female vocals with words that I'm writing.
Cool.
And it's a challenge. What haven't you done enough? There's always more, right?
Always so much. And then
Like
figuring out how to blend them, like you were saying. What was the word you used?
coexist.
Coexist. Yeah, or amalgamate,
I
different.
like amalgam a lot.
Yeah.
I have dibs on that name, by the way. So here's the thing, though. It's only because of, I was thinking about this recently with various artists, that it's only because you believe that it fits together that you can make any case to a listener that no, this fits together. Because when I heard that your music was described as difficult or challenging by some critic, I thought, well, no, we're back to a level of statistical density, Zappa would say, where you're given a plate, a full meal, or even like an Italian meal with the multiple courses, and how they all fit together and how they work is part of how you organize any experience. For instance, I remember reading an article, you would find this interesting, in Perspectives in New Music. Do you remember that magazine? Or it was too American, I don't know. But it was Brian Eno organizing and generating and organizing variety in creativity. I read it in high school, and it became, one of the things. And then, he had the discrete strategies where it's just,
Wow, can you send that to me?
sure. But he came up with Bowie. He came up with this bunch of cards. You can buy them actually still, I think.
Oh,
And it's just something like, think about nothing, shuffle the deck, play blue, shuffle the deck, play something you would never play. So or maybe more general, do something you would never do. So they're prompts.
Okay.
And they used them in making those classic Berlin records,
Oh, okay.
that period, where Eno's really involved, and this whole idea of like, well, you could use it in rock music, but you could use it in improvisation. And this idea of verbal instruction scores with Cage, right? Or the panoply of
Or
verbal
Stockhausen. Yeah.
Stockhausen, the verbal instruction scores. Read this. This is the piece.
Mhm.
That's so interesting too.
Totally. Yeah, that all those ideas like coming out of the 60s too, Cage and like,
Big time.
yeah, like was it that fur music where you rub the fur on a page for a certain amount of time?
Yeah,
Like
like
the
Nam June Paik and the
yeah,
Yoko Ono was involved. What were they called? Fluxists?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean that whole thing.
Yeah.
Um,
I find those
experiential.
ways. Yeah. I just find, like you're saying, I find those all those ways of thinking about music outside of music, but connected to music that gets applied to music is really inspiring.
I think so. Do you find inspiration? What are other modes of inspiration for you that, let's say, are extra musical? I feel like you're a science person. Are you a science person?
It probably looks like it from my titles.
What is
But
that? Just some Braxton like coverage? What is that?
no. I like documentaries and science documentaries. So
Yeah,
I'm
you
constantly
like
like
science.
finding I like science.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like science. But like some of the things, that I've titled, I'm like, oh yeah, that's cool. And then I can't remember what it means.
Okay.
I just like the word.
Very good. It is a really good turn of phrase, diatom ribbons.
Well, that I can tell you what that is if you want to
Please.
know. So diatoms are single cellular algae, and they create like something like 30 or 40% of the Earth's oxygen. So they generate oxygen for us to breathe,
Yeah.
but we don't even see them or know that they're there. And I guess when they live in an ocean and
Mhm.
they create these swirls that you can see from space. So
Mhm.
that's the imagery is diatom ribbons.
Yeah. Well, science is, it's built in already. Guys went there. Xenakis went there. Hardcore. Good luck figuring that out. But it sounds amazing. My friend Doug Lunn, the late great bass player, told me that he had a run-in with the physicist Richard Feynman, who worked on the Manhattan Project with Oppenheimer.
Okay.
And he's written books, and he discovered the throat singers of Tuva. But his next door neighbor of his friend was Richard Feynman in the Bay Area, and he was really friendly. So one day he said to him, Mr. Feynman, Dr. Feynman, can I show you this book, Formalized Music by Yannis Xenakis? He's a student of Corbusier, and he wanted to apply architectural concepts, mathematical concepts to music. Can you look at this and tell me if the math is sound? And he was like, yeah, definitely. I'll look at this. Because he's such a free spirit and super curious guy. And he comes back, he read it overnight. It's, like this, read it overnight, looked at it, and he goes to Doug, yeah, no, it's real. He's talking about something very real. How does it sound? Right?
Yeah.
And that's so cool too, because I wish then you could have played it for him and gotten some reaction, because the science of the thing, like Xenakis, he's looking for verified events, right? So he's going to run the program and look at all the options for any section. It's still cut and paste. It's still curation, right? And that's such an interesting thing too, because do you ever um, edit improvisations for release,
Um,
or are they through
only to
takes?
cut. No, maybe only to cut at the starting at a beginning of a point or an end, but I don't edit the actual material that often. I don't know if I've ever done that.
So when you're doing free improvisation, are you working motifically and whatever the other person is doing is filtering to what you're doing, how are you listening? I'm very interested in the listening process. So when you're improvising, when an improviser improvises, what are they listening to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, it's not limitations or motivic. I would say it's more like a general listening for compositional counterpoint. So if something is active or busy, then I might go and play something slower, or, you know, something's high, I'm gonna go low. What's missing, you know?
Yeah, right.
And then to also question, well, does it make sense to like instigate, clashing? And so maybe you get into the same space as that person. But it's always this element or this way of thinking about counterpoint. Not harmonic counterpoint, but I'm calling it compositional counterpoint.
No, it's such a thing. I mean,
Is
if
that the
you
right
don't,
word? Is that a thing? Is that the term?
in my brain, and as I teach improvisation, I want people to understand what counterpoint is. So even if they're not doing species counterpoint, which I don't know how useful it is. I mean, the idea of notes moving against notes is what's happening in improvisation. So why not listen to it in other contexts like classical music and understand who's leaving space for whom, and what's the character of each line? Counterpoint is musical. It's not necessarily species counterpoint rules. It's counterpoint is actually a conversational term.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then also like recognizing just the power that the timbre of your instrument has in general.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're playing all the time, it loses its impact, it loses its power to an extent. So being strategic about, when to use that power is really important. And to remember that silence and waiting and enjoying what the others are doing is just as important as actually doing something. It might be more important.
It is probably of the primariest importance, if that's a word. It's
When
one
I
of the
listen back
primary
to my
importance.
recordings and I'm like often celebrating the side. I'm like, yes, I didn't play there. That was the right choice.
I created a Cecil William duo by laying out on this record, and
Oh wow.
there's no other one. And because that was one of my strategies was, oh, you know what? I can also not play at all. That was, and so that happened, and they didn't even look at me side eye or anything. That's how anything goes. That man was just in
But you
terms of
you probably also grew up in that environment. Like I I
his
saw,
environment. Certainly, I mean,
yeah,
I studied with Andrew Cyril and Steve McCall to get that information, but I had already gotten it from listening to them. But then I was in touch with that circle of guys who were like, "What are these guys doing? It's so interesting." And talking about orchestrating on the piano, Cecil, the orchestrating on the piano and understanding that for percussion, how, I'm going to have to orchestrate now, and not be a free jazz drummer. Kind of be, but more be like, well, what if it was reimagine the role as a percussionist who plays drum set as well? And that hadn't really been approached in his music. But can you talk a little bit about why Cecil was important for you,
um,
if he was?
he was really important. There's so many things. I mean, people are often calling him like a free jazz musician. To me, like this, what he's doing is very composed. It's almost classical music.
Do you know
Because
Vicky Ray?
no,
Oh, LA Pianist is playing a transcription of
okay,
one of the solo pieces. So we're going there now where notation is happening and people are playing these things because they're put together.
yeah. And the way that he would think about form, it was very similar, from performance to performance. He
Yeah,
had a
yeah.
concept.
Oh, he has strategies.
Yeah, exactly. And then just of course, the physicality with which he plays that, like, that I can never, even attempt to emulate that, but it's so amazing, like watching him and hearing
Yeah.
like how that physicality comes out in the instrument. I'm just in awe of that aspect of his playing.
Yeah, the
And
more, go
sorry,
ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, I don't, I was just, yeah, ruminating on all the things.
Well, that's the thing. There's a lot of areas.
Yeah.
There's periods of time with Cecil where he's trying different things. And the through line of the solo music. Um,
And when he plays with other people, like, have you heard the Mary Lou Williams duo
mhm.
concert? Like, that's bizarre.
It's bizarre.
And there's some other one like Dewey Redman and Elvin Jones. I forgot the name of that record. Like,
That's right. That's right.
plays
That's
on the
right.
first track, and then the rest of the album is him solo or the other musician. Like, they're not
It's
playing
it's a
together.
producer project that went wrong. I can't remember why, but I remember when it was happening, being around that and just going like, but then he played duo with Elvin a lot at that point.
The drums and piano make sense. I mean, I don't know if he's like the best he was really like I mean, his solo piano thing is really my favorite.
Me too.
I like those old records, Dennis Charles, but hearing him play solo is really
Yeah, go back to Indent, folks. I mean, it's all there. It doesn't even sound like he's improvising for the first third of it. It's so carefully worked out pitch structure wise. And then of course the call and response thing. You know, I could go on and on talking about
I
Cecil's
think the
music.
thing that I love the most about him is he's just unapologetically him, like his whole life.
Oh yeah,
He just like he never really bent to anything, like for better for worse. And he loved music. He was inspired. Like he listened to a lot of things. He'd come out and hear people play,
I
55 hours.
went. Yeah, we went to Bradley's to hear Tommy Flanagan.
Yeah.
Yeah, they all loved him. He loved them. John Hicks loved. They loved. Cecil was like part of the piano world. I saw Oscar Peterson play first and Cecil play second at Carnegie Hall. Mass exodus. But it happened. Damn right. Those guys, they all knew that Cecil listened to Tatum. I mean, Cecil's so interesting because I spoke to him a lot about Stravinsky and Bartok and Xenakis. Do you know the Australian pianist Roger Woodward, Xenakis specialist?
No.
So find his Xenakis because Cecil and Xenakis collided with this, solo Xenakis piano first half, solo Cecil second half tour. And those kind of confrontations, that's I think another good term. That kind of confrontational thing of saying, do you see this? We're trying to hand you this connection. That's been such a big thing for me in curating. It's like I'm handing over this connection that things are connected, that you don't have to, that it's about the American, I call the rugged American and individualist composer.
Hmm.
Ives, Feldman. I was around when people made fun of Feldman. That like repeating things? We do not repeat. Constant renewal, says Monsieur Boulez. Yeah. It was like, oh my God, if you were in that world. But Cage didn't give a fuck. He was selling $40,000 pieces that were one sentence on a page at the end. That blew my mind.
Wow.
I witnessed that. Robert Black, the bass player, he commissioned Cage for a piece, 40 grand in like 88. And it was one sentence on a page, instruction. The legend,
Wow.
the man, the legend. So Kris Davis, what's coming up? You have a lot of touring going on. People can hear you play live.
Yeah, I have a new trio record coming out with Jonathan Blake and Robert Hurst. Actually, it's coming out tomorrow, which is the 27th of September. Um, And we are touring through the States first October 5th through 12th. Where are we? We're in Boston and Seattle and Los Angeles, all over. You can find the dates on my website or Instagram, KRIS DAVIS Music. And then I'm doing a tour in Europe with Diatom Ribbons with Terry and Val and a great bass player that lives in Berlin now, Nick Dunstan. What else? I wrote a string quintet for a Polish string quartet, the Ludoslawski Quartet. We played it at Dizzy's in June, and I'm going to premiere it in Poland in November, and we're going to
Awesome.
record it.
That's awesome. Poland's amazing. Although, wow, really went hard right. Interesting.
Wow.
But seriously, that's so great that you're I mean I call it chamber jazz. I don't know if that's useful, but I like to think of these things as chamber jazz. Does the string quartet improvise?
Yeah, they're very good improvisers. And they're also equally good classical players. But they don't have like a language in sort of like the things we think of as jazz,
Right.
jazz things. So um if you want that, like you just said, I don't know. That's not, I didn't incorporate anything like that or expect anyone to, be
No.
speaking on the violin. Um, but yeah, there's like I would say half of the pieces or sections are improvised.
What kind of instructions do you give the string quartet?
Like the first piece has these very quick changes, sort of visiting these little universes and then a kind of a cut jump into
Hmm.
something else. And the piece kind of continues in this way. And there's things from anywhere from like physical kind of graphic scores of like showing double stops moving, in different ways to create a kind of a texture,
Hmm.
to writing something very specific for two or three of the players, and the other player is a free agent
Hmm.
improvising in that moment. So all sorts of different tactics,
Hmm.
sometimes totally free,
Hmm.
sometimes just a written thing about the mood. Yeah, so it's
That's another great word. Tactics.
tactics.
Tactics. Yeah. Um, well, Davis, it's just so great to talk to you about music, and thank you for your music, and thank you for sharing all of this. This is great stuff, people. Where can we find you online?
I mean, if you want to support my music and I run a record label called Pyroclastic Records. You can find all of our records on pyroclasticrecords.com and, purchase things through Bandcamp because that's how we do it.
So that's pyroclasticrecords.bandcamp.com.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Cool. And your website is what?
Kris Davis, KRIS Davis.net.
KrisDavis.net. Kris, thanks so much for taking the time. Folks who are patrons, hang out for a lightning round that we're going to do with Kris. But as always, thank you for supporting, liking, and subscribing. And we'll see you next time on the ProgCast. Thank you, Kris Davis.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.